next story is that the CPI came out. So let's move on to economic news now. The CPI for January 2024 was hotter than expected. So it came in at 3.1% year over year, while the estimate was 2.9% year over year. So after this report came out, it looks like the March FOMC rate cuts are off the table. So unless something crazy happens between now and the March FOMC, it doesn't look like the Fed will move rates in March. And also, May rate cuts, according to the FOMC prediction tool, it looks like May cuts are also looking unlikely. So it's more likely that we won't see any rate cuts in May either. And June rate cuts are about a 50-50 shot. So markets are mostly expecting either June or more likely July for the first rate cut that we're going to get. So yeah, I was wondering what you guys think of it. So number one, what do you think of this report? Do you think that it's going to be indicative of inflation surging back up? Or do you think this is just more of a one-off report and there's not that much to worry about? And do you think that the Fed should be cutting rates in March, or if not, when do you think they should be cutting rates?
Well, potentially it could be like a one-off thing because it's so crazy to me that the S&P 500 is at all-time highs and these like reputable companies are doing extremely well even in this economy. Although like on the day of the CPI report, the market actually dropped a bit, and then that's when I bought a bit of the dip, which was kind of nice. But in hindsight, like any other day of this, like past few weeks, like S&P's flying through the roof. So yeah, no, in general, it's just kind of weird for me. And then in terms of like when the Fed should cut, like in my opinion, yeah, maybe for safety precautions, like if the stock market's doing well anyways, like March can just be a pause, and then maybe potentially the one after that one could be a cut. But when does the next CPI report come out?
Let me look that up because I have that data, but it's in my notes. But while I'm looking that up, Tristan, you want to provide what are your opinions on this?
Yeah, so I was trying to double check on what CPI was last time around, but I feel like this is pretty in line with what it was in the last bit. So I think it's honestly kind of more stagnated more than increased or decreased particularly. And on that front, I think that it's not really that surprising that it's stagnating because I haven't really been feeling like inflation has slowed down completely. So I wasn't super surprised to hear that it was hotter than the projections. I don't think that there's going to be cuts in anytime soon. Honestly, I think June cuts are pretty unlikely. I think we're probably not going to see anything until maybe even the fall at the earliest. So I don't think there's going to be a significant jump on that regard.
Yeah, and you know what the concern is, and I know this is Twitter, and like people say like all types of crazy stuff on Twitter, but some people were suggesting that since the Fed's target is 2% inflation, and we're getting stuck in the threes, it looks like, could the Fed continue to raise rates still at this point?
Well, if they continue to raise rates, oh my god, like which company is going to do a layoff next? It's kind of nuts. Like I guess this is Canadian based, but Bell had layoffs, and didn't you send like layoffs in regards to BlackBerry? These layoffs are certainly still happening, so it's affecting the economy, and then everything's like really expensive, and like houses are like crazy prices. Like it's expensive to borrow money. So how much longer can people last? So I don't know if that's the meta to keep increasing the rates. That's kind of like a Darth Vader forced strangle, it's terrible, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, but I think the concern is that if we really get stuck in the threes and it just doesn't go anywhere, or it might even like go back up, then at some point, I think if it really does start to surge inflation, then the Fed at some point will have to be forced to hike rates even more, which would not be good. But that's not my base case, though. I don't think that that's gonna really happen. But Tristan, more thoughts?
Yeah, so I don't think that it's likely that they'll raise rates again, at least not in the short term. I believe Jay Powell suggested that they were done raising rates for a while. And then I think it's unlikely that they're going to raise them unless CPI starts rising dramatically again. If it starts going up to like 3.4, 3.5, and then continues, I think they may kick rate hikes back in, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think it is on the downtrend, so I think we're probably seeing around. I think it's probably going to keep coming down, but I think it's going to be a slow grind to get back to 2%. So I wouldn't be counting your bets on CPI inflation coming down sufficiently that they cut rates anytime soon.
And the next CPI report for February of 2024 is on March 12th, by the way, at 8:30 a.m. Eastern. But yeah, anyways, back to my thoughts. Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think that is very likely that inflation will just surge back up, right? Because a lot of people are under this false impression that we got to like crush the economy in order to crush inflation, and I really don't think that that's the case, because if you look at the past, I don't know, 10 years, ever since we got out of the great financial crisis of 08 or 09, economic growth has been super high in Western countries, at least in Canada and the United States, and our inflation was chronically below 2% while we had big growth, right? It's because economic growth, it increases the amount of goods and services available in the economy in the first place. And that's actually deflationary. That drives prices down. So that's why we had low inflation and high economic growth. So a lot of people are looking at, the strong GDP numbers that are coming out of the United States and strong earnings reports that tech companies are outputting. And they're saying like, oh, this is going to cause inflation to spike back up. I really don't think that that's the case. I think if anything, it's the opposite. It puts a deflationary force on the economy. But yeah, do you guys agree with that, or?
Can you just repeat the last bit of that, because regarding the specific question?
Yeah. So do you guys agree with this statement that strong economic growth is a deflationary force on the economy and it doesn't lead to high inflation as some are fearing?
I don't think that. So yeah. So I think that it is not necessarily. I think it's unlikely that it is inflationary. It may be inflationary, but I don't think it's in. Like, I don't think there's a direct correlation between economic growth and inflation. I think that a lot of the time when there has been a lot of economic growth, there hasn't been significant inflation. And in that regard, I think to your point, I think you're getting at with the deflationary is that as companies do better and grow and become more efficient, they may not raise prices as aggressively, which results in inflation basically reducing the cost of the good. Is that kind of what you're getting at, sort of?
Yeah, exactly. And like, maybe this is a bit of a hot take. This is definitely, I think, a contrarian opinion. So I'll let you guys think about it and decide if you agree with this hot take or not. But I actually think that raising interest rates, or the current rate that interest rates are at right now, might actually be making the inflation problem worse. And you're thinking, like, how does that happen? Like, how does raising rates make inflation worse? Well, think about it. Raising rates slows down economic activity. So when you slow down economic activity, that leads to companies not wanting to do business the way that they were doing before, and it slows down businesses across the board. So that leads to less products and less goods and services that are available in the economy. So that kind of piggybacks on what I said about economic growth leading to deflation earlier, right? So when you have high rates, you're slowing down the economy, and that actually makes inflation worse because you're reducing the amount of goods and services available, and that drives prices up because you drive supply down. So that's kind of what I'm getting at, and I think that maybe that's an aspect that we're not talking about with all these talking about FOMC rate hikes or rate cuts. I think that maybe if Jay Powell got out there and was like, "Hey, we're cutting by 25 basis points just as a starter, just to kind of get some relief out into the economy," I think that that could actually be really good for both inflation and economic growth. Like it'll spur economic growth because people will think, "Oh, rates are coming down. It's becoming easier and easier to do business, and the pain is the worst of the pain is behind us." And then that'll encourage them to increase their economic activity and provide more goods and services, and then that actually drives prices down. So this is maybe like, if you guys know Erdogan, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who's the president of Turkey, this is one of the arguments that he made, where he because I mean, granted, Turkey has a different kind of inflation problem where their inflation is insanely high. So the central bank wanted to raise interest rates to combat that. And he's like, no, we're actually going to lower interest rates because we're going to try and grow our way out of it. And, Turkey hasn't collapsed, although their inflation rate is still super high. It's come down despite, them doing this weird strategy of lowering interest rates when inflation is high. So, I mean, I think there is some truth to it. Like, it sounds absolutely insane, but I think, it could work, right? I don't know. Thoughts?
Could you just repeat your question from before, just in case?
Yeah. So my question was, do you think that cutting interest rates would spur more economic growth? And if that's the case, could that economic growth actually drive inflation down? Because economic growth leads to more products and services that are available.
Well, okay. So like if rates lower, then more money is cheaper to borrow. So if more money is cheaper to borrow, companies can use that to better their supplies and then maybe do better marketing, etc. So like these companies end up doing a lot better. And if these companies do a lot better, then there's more economic growth. And if there's more economic growth, then maybe potentially they're able to pay their employees a lot better. If they pay their employees a lot better, then they're going to spend a lot more money and there's going to be more demand and more need for supply for things. So I guess it would be maybe a lot more beneficial then. So yeah, no, I don't think it would inflate everything. Maybe it would just say stagnate and deflate because there's like a lot more economic circulation, I guess, if
Yeah. So
rates
what
cut.
I'm
So
saying is that, under our, this is maybe more of a Keynesian argument. And you guys know me, I'm a big Bitcoin believer. So I'm more subscribed to the Austrian side of economics. But without getting too deep into that, since we're within a Keynesian system, um, do you think that just spurring economic growth, which I think is not necessarily even Keynesian versus Austrian, but just spurring economic growth with low interest rates in general, I think could be beneficial. And is there a way that we can have our cake and eat it too? Meaning that, is there a way that we can have low inflation and high economic growth, and less job losses and low unemployment and all that stuff? Like, can we have our cake and eat it too? That is my big question.
I think also on that front, what you're suggesting with the deflation, with the economic growth and like growing out of the problem, I think that is a perception that you could have, and I suspect that there is a correlation between economic growth and the like a reduction in the inflation rate. That being said, I don't know if that amount is sufficient to offset the additional having, like, say we have lower rates basically lowering rates increases the artificially basically increases the spending rate of companies. They choose to spend more, which doesn't necessarily result in those companies producing more economic growth. So if they don't produce more economic growth, yet they're having access to all this extra funds that basically just inflates the money supply, we now have a scenario where you've kind of fueled the fire by increasing the money supply even more by lowering rates without having the economic effect that you were expecting to offset the inflation that already occurred. And since inflation is kind of a lagged effect, like they printed money a while ago, and now we are feeling the effects now, you could be running into a scenario where down the line you're again facing this problem where, oh no, we've got too much inflation and we now have to try and raise rates or do something to resolve it. So it's basically like raising rates is like slowing down the rate at which the spending, but the spending the spending isn't necessarily going to something productive. Is kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, but I think to that effect, raising interest rates, it's not stopping the US government from spending more money and accumulating more national debt. In fact, like the amount of debt spending has like increased dramatically. And I think that's also part of the reason why raising interest rates are problematic because like the United States government is basically raising interest rates on itself for the debt that it has borrowed. And if I remember correctly, a couple of weeks or days ago, all blends together, but the U.S. national debt has eclipsed 34 trillion already, and it was under 34 trillion when we started the new year. So it's been only like 2 months, and they've added hundreds of billions of dollars additionally to the national debt, and 5.5%. Excuse me. 5.5% might not sound like a big number, but when you apply it to 34 trillion, that's a huge number. And the US is spending that like every year or for as long as the rate remains high, that they have to roll the old debt into new debt at this high rate. And I think that that's just unsustainable. And I'm not sure what the solution or if there is a solution, but they could at least maybe make the problem a little bit better by lowering interest rates a little bit earlier so that they don't have to roll a bunch of debt into high interest rate bonds. But yeah, what do you guys think of that?
Oh man, it's super hard to say. Like, who knows what the future unfolds for us? But this is kind of like a random question I have. Like, so like let's say for example deflation happens. Does that mean like all goods and like groceries and like etc. would lower in price? I mean, like inevitably, yes, but like if you think about like the 1940s where a hamburger was like 40 cents, it wouldn't go to that extent. Like let's say for example, a meal at I don't know, Montana's or Boston Pizza's what, $18-15? Would that just go down to $12 or $13? It's hard to say, no. Like what happens?
It's probably like the best example that I can think of in modern days is TVs.
Okay.
So when you think about how much a TV costs back in like 2008 or like earlier, they were really, really expensive for like a pretty run-of-the-mill TV. You were looking at several $100s for something that was okay. And then we've kind of moved into a period starting in like 2016-ish, I think. I'm not 100% certain, but where TVs, there was a lot of competition in the space, and TVs were coming down in price rapidly because of the competition, the cost of producing higher tier panels and just slapping them on cheaper model TVs was reduced. And that is kind of like an example of deflation. So it's not necessarily that your Montana's meal is going to be cheaper. It's that you may get a cheaper option that is available for you. And I mean, like in the basis sense of deflation, yes, it would be kind of like Montana's meal is cheaper. But in the real sense, it's more so it's more likely that you're going to see products become cheaper because from the economic growth perspective, there's more access to economies of scale. There's companies that are becoming more efficient. The panel technology is becoming, like, stuff is becoming cheaper to produce, and as a result, some of those savings in a competitive landscape are being passed down to the consumer because that's how they get us to purchase stuff.
Yeah, that's true. Like, you actually
Mhm.
made me think. So like grocery stores, it's really expensive to farm things, like to water things, and then to drive the produce over to the grocery store because everything's really expensive right now. But then let's say there's deflation, then all of those would be reduced. And then if you keep your prices way too high, there's going to be a competitor that lowers the price, and then people will buy from them. And okay, so like that will, so they're gonna have to lower the price. And then, sorry, Andy, what was your question again? Because like I just went on the tangent. It was just something I'm curious about. But yeah.
No, I was saying that actually ties into the question perfectly. I think it's, do you think that uh, if we lowered interest rates to spur more economic growth, do you think that is gonna actually lower inflation? It's gonna make the inflation problem better, right? It's gonna, because you're speeding up the amount of economic activity that happens, and you're making it easier for businesses to do business
Oh
when you lower
wait.
interest rates.
Yeah, okay, that's kind of what I just said. So maybe because like everything will be cheaper logistically to do, and then therefore maybe prices will get cheaper, and then that will cause deflation. But like I think for a situation, a topic like this, you kind of need a graph to draw everything out. It's really hard to think about. You know what I mean? But
Yeah, no, for sure. Like, I think deflation is the one of the least understood kind of topics in economics. And my opinion of that is, I'm a Bitcoiner, so I love deflation. I think deflation is great, and the natural way of things is deflation. Like, your money should be more valuable every day because technology gets better every day. Things get more efficient. The size of the economic pie expands every day. But like, why is it that we accept that our money becomes worth less and less every day, every year, whatever, right? So, the argument against deflation is that, oh, people won't. Excuse me. The argument against that is that people won't spend their money; they'll just hoard their money and just not do anything with it ever. Well, no, that's not true, right? Because, like, yes, you can maybe hold your money. Let's say if iPhones deflated by like 5% every year, are you just never gonna buy a phone? You're gonna be like, okay, if I don't buy a phone this year, I can buy the next phone that comes out the year after for 5% cheaper, because sometimes that happens, even though iPhones have been going up in price. But let's say that it goes down by 5% every year, right? That's at some point you have to decide. I need this iPhone now, so yes, I can get it for 5% cheaper next year, but I'm gonna get it now, right? So same thing with food. It's like, are you not gonna buy that pack of ground beef because next year is going to be 10% cheaper? Like, you're going to wait a year before you eat. So you're definitely going to buy groceries now, even though, even if it's deflating, even if it gets cheaper a year from now, you're still going to buy your groceries at the more expensive price, or right now, right? So I think that people misunderstand deflation, and deflation is good. So, back to your Montana's meal example, right? So if Montana's meals got cheaper instead of more expensive, are you gonna wait until it gets even cheaper before you go to Montana's? No, you're probably just gonna go to Montana's. If anything, you're gonna go to Montana's way more than you do now, right? So deflation is good. And the fact that we kind of just accept a 2% inflation target as the standard or golden rate of inflation, is, it's robbery in a sense, right? It's like theft of wealth, because your money is being stolen at 2% a year if inflation is at 2%. And they say it's at 2%. It's actually been more than 2% if you look at things like housing, or post-secondary education, groceries, things like that. But even if it's at 2%, why do we accept 2%? Right? It should be zero, or it should be preferably deflationary. But that was, that's my second hot take of the day.
I mean, you can also, just regards to deflationary stuff, with your iPhone example, iPhones are basically deflationary already, because if I want to buy this year's iPhone and I don't want to buy it this year because that's too much money, I wait till next year, I can buy it for some amount less. And yes, they've come up with a new iPhone, but if I want to buy that new iPhone, I've got to accept that I'm going to pay a premium to have it now instead of next year. And so, it's not like we don't see deflationary acts or deflationary products currently, and it's not like they're not proving to be desirable and purchased.